The doctor's hands were trembling. I watched her eyes stay fixed on my file, not on the ultrasound screen where my baby's heartbeat flashed in black and white. She wasn't looking at the image at all. She was staring at the paperwork, at my husband's name printed neatly at the top of the page. Then, without warning, she turned off the monitor, right in the middle of the exam, as if someone had cut the power to my entire life. "Mrs. Mercer," she said quietly, her voice barely audible, "I need to speak with you in private. Right now." She guided me to her office, shut the door, and locked it. I immediately thought something was wrong with the baby. My heart was racing so loudly I could hear it. I couldn't breathe properly. My thoughts wouldn't settle. Then she said the words that shattered everything I believed. "You need to leave your husband today, before you go home. Find a divorce lawyer first." I laughed. I actually laughed out loud. "What? Why? We're expecting a child. We're happy. This doesn't make sense." That's exactly the issue. Her face was pale, almost colorless. "What I'm about to show you will change everything you think you know about your marriage. But I need to start at the beginning, because you have to understand how I ended up in that office, 4 months pregnant, realizing my entire life was built on lies told by the man who slept beside me every night. My name is Daphne Wilson. I'm 32 years old. I work as a marketing director at a boutique firm in Connecticut, and I come from what people politely call old money. My grandmother Eleanor passed away 5 years ago and left me her estate, about $2.3 million held in trust, along with the historic Wilson family home where 5 generations of women had lived, loved, and raised children. I never showed it off. I built my own career. I drove a 10-year-old Subaru and bought my coffee from the same place every morning. The inheritance was stability, not my identity. But it made me a target. I just didn't realize it yet. I met Grant Mercer 4 years ago at my family's annual charity gala. The Wilsons had hosted it for decades. That night, I was standing at the bar, trying to escape a man who asked about my finances within 3 minutes of meeting me. Subtle, right? Then Grant appeared. Tall, dark hair, relaxed smile. He asked what I was drinking and joked about the awful jazz band. He never mentioned money. He said he was a financial advisor who had received a last-minute invitation from a colleague and claimed he didn't even know who the Wilson family was. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. A financial advisor who doesn't research the host family of a major charity event is like a chef showing up to a cooking competition saying, "Oh, we're cooking today?" But I was exhausted by obvious gold diggers, and here was someone asking about my favorite books instead of my bank account. We dated for a year. Grant was attentive and considerate. He remembered small details and insisted on paying for dinners, even though I could easily afford them. He seemed sincere. My mother, Vivian, wasn't convinced. After meeting him once, she pulled me aside and said his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Something's wrong with him, Daphne. I can feel it." I accused her of being paranoid, overprotective, even jealous. We argued constantly about Grant until we eventually stopped talking altogether. Nearly 2 years of silence between me and the woman who raised me. Birthday texts, nothing more. All because I trusted my husband over my own mother. As it turns out, she was right, and she's waited patiently to say it. She earned that moment. Grant and I married after a year together. The ceremony was held at my grandmother's estate. It was beautiful. He cried during his vows, tears streaming as he promised to love and protect me forever. Looking back, those were probably the most honest tears he ever shed. Not tears of joy, but of relief. His long plan was finally working. After 2 years of trying to conceive naturally, we visited a fertility specialist. The diagnosis hit hard. Grant had severe male factor infertility. His sperm count was almost zero, and what little was present barely moved. Natural conception was essentially impossible. Grant appeared devastated. He cried in the car for 20 minutes and apologized repeatedly, as if it were his fault. I comforted him and told him we would handle it together. That's what marriage meant to me. What I didn't know was that his tears weren't grief. They were calculation. His plan had just become far more complicated. We chose IVF with a specialized procedure called ICSI, where a single sperm is injected directly into an egg. It was our best option. Grant insisted on researching clinics himself. He found one he said was ideal and took care of all the paperwork. At the time, I thought he was being supportive because I was emotionally exhausted. The first cycle failed, and I was crushed. I stayed in bed for 3 days. Grant held me, encouraged me, promised we would try again. The second cycle, 7 months ago, succeeded. A positive pregnancy test, 2 pink lines that changed everything. I cried tears of relief and happiness. Grant held me and talked about nursery colors, baby names, and the future he said he'd always wanted. Then he casually suggested I update my will now that we were becoming a family. I thought it was thoughtful and responsible. I had no idea he was already treating my grandmother's money as his own. Everything seemed perfect. A loving husband, a baby on the way, the life I imagined as a child playing in my grandmother's garden. I had no idea that in just 3 months, a stranger with shaking hands would show me documents that would reduce that perfect life to ashes. And I had no idea that the fire had been lit by the man sleeping beside me every night. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment, and it truly means a lot. Now back to the story. At 4 months pregnant, something in my marriage began to change. It started with small things, the kind you notice but dismiss because the truth feels too painful. Grant began placing his phone face down everywhere. He added a new password I didn't know. He began stepping outside to take phone calls, then returned saying it was work-related, and changed the subject before I could ask anything. He claimed he was reorganizing client portfolios during late-night calls at 11 o'clock on a Saturday. I'm not a financial expert, but I'm fairly sure the stock market doesn't operate on weekends. Unless Grant suddenly had clients in Tokyo, which he didn't, something else was happening. His late nights at the office increased. 3 times a week, sometimes 4, he wouldn't come home until midnight. He was a financial advisor, not an emergency room doctor. There was no reasonable explanation for that schedule. Then I found receipts. A restaurant downtown I had never been to, $280 for dinner for 2. A hotel in the city, 40 minutes from our house. There was no logical reason for my husband to need a hotel room so close to home. When I asked him about it, Grant had answers ready. Smooth, rehearsed responses that came a little too fast. A client dinner. Important networking. The hotel was for a conference that ran late, and it made more sense to stay overnight than drive home tired. When I pushed further, when I asked follow-up questions, his tone shifted. He told me I was being paranoid, said it was the hormones, claimed his mother had warned him about this, that pregnancy makes women irrational. He told me not to become one of those wives. I felt embarrassed for questioning him at all. He was that effective. I ended up apologizing for doubting him. Around the same time, the pressure about money intensified. His requests became more frequent, more urgent, and more strategic. He suggested adding his name to my trust in case something happened during delivery. He said he needed access to funds for the baby, and that it was practical. He pushed for power of attorney, calling it common sense and saying every married couple did it. He said my grandmother's house was too large for us and that we should sell it and invest the money properly. He claimed he knew exactly which funds would bring the best returns. He wanted me to sell my grandmother's home and hand him control of the proceeds. This was the same man who needed 3 different streaming services because he couldn't remember where his shows were. That was who I was supposed to trust with $2 million. I refused. Calmly and carefully. The moment I said no, his warmth disappeared. He became distant and cold. He slept on the far edge of the bed, blaming my pregnancy and saying I moved too much. Arguments increased. He brought up the trust repeatedly. When I refused, he gave me the silent treatment for days at a time. Those silent stretches lasted exactly until he got hungry. Apparently, his principles had limits. He stopped touching me, blaming my changing body and saying he didn't want to harm the baby. It sounded considerate, but it felt like rejection. I tried to talk about it. He said I was needy, hormonal, and difficult. I started wondering if I was the problem. One night, I woke up around 2 in the morning and realized Grant wasn't in bed. I found him in the kitchen, bent over his phone, speaking quietly. I stood in the hallway and listened. "It's almost time," he said. "By spring, everything will be settled." He turned, saw me, and immediately hung up. He said it was a work emergency and told me to go back to sleep. I didn't ask who had work emergencies at 2 a.m. involving things being settled by spring. I was exhausted, heavily pregnant, and desperate to believe my marriage was still intact. The following week, my best friend Tara came over for lunch. She sat across from me and watched as I made excuse after excuse for Grant, his stress, his workload, his adjustment to becoming a father. Finally, she put her fork down and looked at me in a way only someone who has known you for years can. She asked when the last time was that I'd spoken to my mother. I didn't answer. She asked when the last time was that Grant seemed genuinely happy to see me. Not performing for others, not pretending, but truly glad to see me. I couldn't answer that either. She told me to trust my instincts, that something was wrong. I dismissed her as dramatic, but that night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Grant's phone, always face down, the late nights, the sudden fixation on my money, and the way he sometimes looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching, like I was a problem to solve instead of a person to love. At 4 months pregnant, I went to a routine OB appointment for an ultrasound. My regular doctor was on vacation, so I was scheduled with Dr. Claire Brennan instead. I went alone. Grant said he had a client meeting he couldn't miss. It was supposed to be a normal visit. I lay back on the exam table, cold gel on my stomach, waiting to see my baby move on the screen. Dr. Brennan was polite and professional, asking how I felt and whether the baby was active. Then she opened my file, looked at the paperwork, and her expression changed. She looked at my husband's name, then at me, then back at the name. I saw her hands begin to shake. She set the ultrasound wand down and turned off the monitor. "Mrs. Mercer," she said quietly, "I need to speak with you privately right now." I assumed something was wrong with the baby. Every worst possibility ran through my mind in seconds. She took me to her office, closed the door, locked it, and then said the words that broke everything open. She told me she knew what my husband had done and that she had proof. She pulled a folder from her desk, her hands still trembling. She explained that her younger sister worked at my fertility clinic. 3 weeks earlier, her sister had come to her in tears and told her everything. When Dr. Brennan saw my husband's name on my file, she recognized it immediately. She told me I needed to see the documents before I went home, before my husband realized I knew. She opened the folder, and everything I believed about my marriage, my pregnancy, and the man I loved collapsed in front of me. Her sister, Molly, was a nurse at the fertility clinic Grant had insisted we use for IVF, the clinic he said was perfect. I finally understood why he had been so specific. Dr. Brennan explained that 3 weeks earlier, Molly had arrived at her apartment late at night, sobbing and exhausted. She hadn't been sleeping, had lost weight, and had been consumed by guilt for months. 7 months earlier, a patient's husband had approached her at the clinic. He was charming, well-dressed, and said he had a sensitive situation that required discretion. He claimed his wife didn't know, but he was using donor sperm due to a family genetic issue he didn't want to burden her with. He offered to pay for help keeping it quiet. $30,000 to a nurse earning $52,000 a year and buried in debt was hard to refuse. Molly helped switch the samples. Grant's sperm, which couldn't have resulted in a pregnancy, was replaced with donor sperm. The embryologist was involved as well. Grant had paid him separately. Together, they ensured the switch went unnoticed. The embryologist told Molly not to worry, saying it wasn't their concern what arrangements married couples made. But the guilt grew once Molly saw the records showing the pregnancy was successful. Somewhere, a woman believed she was carrying her husband's child, and she wasn't. The weight of that knowledge broke her. She became anxious, missed work, and suffered panic attacks. 3 weeks earlier, she finally confessed everything to her sister. I sat there as Dr. Brennan finished explaining how my husband had spent $50,000 to set me up to look like I had cheated on him. $50,000. That was more than he spent on our entire wedding, including the honeymoon. I suppose that was when I finally understood where his true priorities had always been, and they were never about celebration or commitment. And that wasn't even the worst of it. There was much more. Claire explained the full scheme, the plan Grant had been assembling carefully for more than a year. Phase 1 was already done. He bribed clinic staff, arranged the sperm switch, and made sure everyone involved stayed silent. Phase 2 was also complete. He waited for a successful pregnancy, played the role of the devoted and excited future father, and built a flawless public image. Phase 3 was scheduled for after the baby's birth. Grant planned to have the embryologist alter the clinic records so they would show that our second IVF cycle had failed. On paper, it would look as if we had conceived naturally afterward. Phase 4 was the setup. After the birth, he intended to suggest a DNA test, presenting it as something sentimental, a keepsake for the nursery, proof of fatherhood, a celebration of our family. Phase 5 was the final blow. When the DNA test showed he wasn't the biological father, and when the medical records showed we had supposedly conceived naturally, he would have everything he needed. His wife had cheated. The child wasn't his. He was the victim. Our prenuptial agreement included an infidelity clause, common in wealthy families to protect assets. If one spouse cheated, they owed the other $500,000 in penalties, forfeited any claim to the other's property, and could also be sued for emotional damages. Grant's endgame was obvious. He would walk away with at least $500,000, destroy my reputation, likely gain more through legal action, and leave me so devastated and confused that I wouldn't fight back effectively. He was relying on my shame to keep me compliant. He nearly succeeded. Dr. Brennan pulled additional documents from the folder. Molly had saved everything. Original sample records showing the switch, the donor's identification number, payment trails linked to accounts Grant controlled. There were emails between Grant and the embryologist. They had tried to be discreet, using personal accounts and vague wording, but the evidence was more than sufficient. Molly had even located the donor. His name was Derek Sykes, a 28-year-old graduate student who had been paid $15,000 in cash. Normal sperm donation pays around $100 or $200. That amount alone should have raised alarms, but student loans have a way of silencing doubts. Derek had been told it was a private arrangement for a couple seeking discretion. He had no idea he was involved in fraud. When he learned the truth, he was angry and fully cooperative. There was one more thing, Claire added carefully, something she had uncovered herself. Grant had $180,000 in gambling debts. He'd been gambling for years. Online poker, sports betting, casino trips he claimed were business conferences, all while presenting himself as a responsible financial advisor with his life in order. The money used for the bribes, the $50,000 he spent corrupting my IVF process and framing me for adultery, had been embezzled from his own clients. Small amounts taken over time, carefully hidden in accounting records. His firm didn't know yet. Grant wasn't only trying to steal my inheritance. He was desperate. His gambling debts were crushing him, and the people he owed weren't patient lenders. They weren't the kind who filed lawsuits when payments stopped. I was supposed to be his solution. My grandmother's money was meant to save him, and he was willing to destroy me to get it. I sat in that office for a long time, the documents spread out in front of me, the truth pressing heavily on my chest. Shock came first, cold and numbing, then disbelief. I reread the papers repeatedly, searching for an error, some explanation that could undo everything. Slowly, the pieces aligned. The late nights, the secret calls, his fixation on accessing my money, the calculated attention when we first dated. He had researched me before we ever met. That charity gala wasn't a coincidence. He knew exactly who I was and what I represented before he ever introduced himself. The tears at our wedding, which I believed were from happiness, were tears of relief. His long deception was finally working. And my mother, Vivian, whom I had pushed away for 2 years, whom I had labeled paranoid and jealous, had seen through him in minutes. His smile doesn't reach his eyes. She tried to warn me. I chose him instead. I considered crying. I considered screaming. I thought about going home and confronting him, throwing the evidence in his face and watching him scramble. Then something else took hold. A calm, focused resolve settled in. He believed I was foolish. He built this plan assuming I would collapse, that once the trap closed, I would be so ashamed and broken that I would give him whatever he wanted to make it stop. He believed I was weak. He had no idea who he married. I looked at Dr. Brennan and confirmed that Grant didn't know I was aware. She said no. Her sister hadn't told anyone else, and she had only connected me to the case when she saw my file. That was good. I carefully gathered the papers and asked for copies of everything. I also asked to speak with Molly directly. When Dr. Brennan asked what I planned to do, I stood up, resting my hand on my stomach. The baby was innocent in all of this. A child who didn't choose their biology and whom I already loved, regardless of DNA or donor records. My husband thinks he's been playing chess, I said. He thinks he's 3 moves ahead. He thinks he's already won. I straightened my shoulders. He's about to learn I've already overturned the board. I drove home with my expression neutral, hands steady on the wheel, breathing controlled. Grant had installed security cameras around our house 2 years earlier, claiming they were for safety. Now I wondered if they were for monitoring me, if he watched footage looking for signs of suspicion. I gave him none. He was waiting in the kitchen when I arrived, wearing that familiar smile that never reached his eyes. My mother's words echoed in my mind, 2 years too late. He asked how the appointment went and whether the baby was okay. I smiled, hugged him, and handed him the ultrasound photo Dr. Brennan had printed before everything changed. I told him everything was perfect. I performed flawlessly. Over dinner, I smiled while calculating what his bail might cost. I asked about his day while picturing him in an orange jumpsuit. I even laughed at his joke about baby names. I apologized for being paranoid lately, blamed hormones, and repeated the same excuse he'd used on me for months. His body relaxed instantly. He believed everything was still on track. That night, he slept soundly. I stayed awake until 3 a.m, planning carefully. The next day, I called in sick and drove 2 hours to another city, checking my mirrors constantly. I hired a private investigator named Rosalind Weaver, a former police detective with 15 years on the force. She was direct, sharp, and unimpressed by excuses. I told her everything. She listened, took notes, and when I finished, she smiled with quiet confidence. She told me arrogant men always make mistakes and asked for 2 weeks. She had results in 10 days. Grant's gambling debts totaled $180,000. He owed money to betting sites, underground poker games, and private lenders who didn't report to the IRS. The embezzlement was confirmed, about $53,000 missing from client accounts over 18 months, siphoned in small transactions. His firm still didn't know. And then there was the affair. 8 months with his assistant. Hotel rooms, dinners, weekend trips disguised as business travel. Rosalind had photos, messages, receipts, the entire record, his assistant. Predictable. Almost disappointing in its lack of originality. And there was more. This wasn't his first attempt to target a wealthy woman. 5 years earlier, he had dated Caroline Ashford in Boston. Family money, trust fund. They lasted 8 months before she discovered irregularities in a joint account he convinced her to open. She ended it immediately, but was too embarrassed to pursue charges. Rosalind located her. Caroline was now fully willing to give a statement. She had always regretted letting him walk away without consequences. I met Molly Brennan privately, in a coffee shop an hour outside town where neither of us would be recognized. She looked exhausted. Thin, pale, dark circles under her eyes. Guilt had clearly taken a toll. She started crying as soon as I sat down. She kept apologizing, saying she knew it was wrong, that she needed the money, that Grant was convincing, and that she believed he was protecting me from a genetic issue. I stopped her and asked only one question. Was she willing to testify officially, on the record? She nodded immediately. She said she would tell everything and that she should have gone to the police the day after it happened. She admitted she had been terrified of losing her license, her job, everything. But she was ready now, and she would say it all under oath. I studied her for a moment. This woman had helped my husband try to ruin my life. She had taken $30,000 to participate in fraud. By definition, she was complicit. But Grant had manipulated her the same way he had manipulated me. He had identified her vulnerability and used it. He was the designer of the plan. She was a tool. I told her not to be afraid anymore. I said she wasn't the villain in this story. He was. Once the embryologist learned that Molly was cooperating and had kept records, he suddenly developed a conscience of his own. He gave a full statement to Rosalind. He was terrified of losing his medical license and going to prison, and was willing to cooperate completely to protect himself. The hardest call I made was to my mother. 2 years of near silence. 2 years of choosing Grant over her. I had defended him, stopped inviting her to holidays, accused her of jealousy and paranoia, and dismissed every warning she gave me. The phone rang twice before she answered. She said my name carefully, with hope and caution, like someone who had been waiting for that call for years, but didn't want to believe it yet. I told her she had been right about everything and apologized. I braced myself for anger, for resentment, for the "I told you so" she had earned. Instead, she asked what I needed. She didn't gloat. She didn't list every warning I had ignored. She simply focused on helping me. That broke me more than anything else. My mother is a retired attorney who specialized in estate law for 30 years. Within 48 hours, she connected me with the best divorce lawyer in Connecticut and a criminal prosecutor who handled fraud cases. She reminded me, without saying it directly, that people who truly love you don't need to be right. They just want you safe. I had chosen a con man over her for 2 years, and the moment I finally broke down, her instinct was still to protect me. Grant never understood that kind of loyalty because he had never experienced it. My lawyer, Sandra Kowalski, was 5'2", silver-haired, with reading glasses permanently balanced on her nose. She looked like a kind grandmother. She was anything but soft. She reviewed everything: clinic records, Molly's statement, the donor information, the affair evidence, and the embezzlement trail. When she finished, she looked up and smiled. She explained that Grant was facing fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement charges. The prenuptial infidelity clause now worked in my favor, since he was the one who had cheated. His plan to falsify medical records after the birth was a felony, and we had clear evidence of intent. She coordinated directly with the prosecutor. Molly gave a sworn statement to police. The embryologist cooperated in exchange for reduced charges. Grant's firm was discreetly alerted, launched its own investigation, and froze his access to client accounts. A judge reviewed the evidence, found probable cause, and issued an arrest warrant. My lawyer called it procedural. I called it justice. 6 weeks after that ultrasound appointment, I suggested to Grant that we host a baby celebration at my grandmother's estate. A garden gathering, both families, close friends, an afternoon to celebrate the baby. His eyes lit up immediately. More witnesses, more chances to perform the devoted husband role. More people who would later feel sorry for him when his story unfolded. He called it a wonderful idea and offered to help plan. I told him I would handle everything, since he had been working so hard. He had no idea that my planning included police officers waiting nearby, my lawyer positioned discreetly, Derek Sykes prepared to testify, every document organized, and his parents about to learn the truth. The party was scheduled for Saturday. That morning, Grant stood in the bathroom, practicing expressions, adjusting his tie, rehearsing his excited father smile. I watched through the doorway. The man I had trusted with my future believed he was approaching his greatest success. He had no idea what was coming. The estate was perfect that afternoon. Gardens in full bloom, white tents on the lawn, champagne chilled, flowers everywhere, a string quartet playing softly. 50 guests arrived, family and friends dressed for celebration. Grant's parents were proud and beaming. My grandmother would have loved the gathering. She also would have seen through Grant instantly. Experience does that. Grant moved through the crowd effortlessly, shaking hands, laughing, placing his hand on my belly whenever a camera appeared. He played the role perfectly. His mother wiped away tears, praising him as a caring husband and future father. His father spoke proudly about legacy and family. My mother stood quietly near the dessert table, watching with calm focus. She met my eyes and lifted her glass slightly. It was almost time. Around 3 o'clock, Grant did exactly what I expected. He had been hinting for weeks about a DNA test, framing it as sentimental and meaningful. At the party, he brought it up again, loudly enough for others to hear. He pulled me close and suggested we get a DNA test kit and frame the results in the nursery as proof of their bond. Guests reacted warmly, murmuring approval, exactly as he intended. His mother dabbed her eyes again as I pretended to hesitate. "I don't know," I said softly. "That sounds like a lot of effort." He pressed on immediately. "Come on, it'll be perfect. We could even open the results right here, right now. Make it part of the celebration. What do you all think?" The crowd responded with approving murmurs. Someone said it was sweet. Another commented that they wished their husband were that thoughtful. I looked around, still playing the hesitant wife. Well, if everyone thinks it's a good idea. Grant was nearly radiant. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The plan he'd spent over a year setting up was about to close. Only he had no idea who was actually caught. He was already imagining my money, my shame, my collapse, without realizing the trap wasn't meant for me. If this story has kept your attention so far, feel free to show support and share your thoughts. Now, here is what happened next. Instead of bringing out a DNA kit, I walked toward the small platform near the fountain that had been prepared for speeches. I picked up the microphone. Grant looked up at me, smiling, champagne in hand, already preparing his performance for what he believed would come next. "Thank you all for being here today," I said, my voice steady as it carried across the lawn. "This gathering is meant to be about celebration, about family, and about truth." I met Grant's eyes. "My husband said he wanted to reveal something special today, so I'm going to help him do exactly that." His smile faltered for just a moment. I reached beneath the podium and pulled out a folder. 3 months ago, I learned something about my husband that changed everything I believed about my marriage. I'm sharing it now because Grant is right. This should be about the truth. His expression froze, his glass hovering in midair. I explained that we had struggled with fertility, that his diagnosis made natural conception impossible, and that we pursued IVF at a clinic he selected. Holding up the first document, I said these are the original clinic records, before they were altered. I let the words settle. Grant's face drained of color. The records showed that he bribed 2 clinic employees to replace his sample with donor sperm. He paid a nurse $30,000, compensated the embryologist, and paid $15,000 to a young man named Derek Sykes. I gestured, and Derek stepped forward, explaining he believed he was helping a couple, not committing fraud. The sperm used to conceive my child was obtained without my knowledge or consent. Gasps moved through the crowd. A glass shattered on the stone patio. I continued, explaining Grant's plan. Wait until the baby was born, demand a DNA test, then accuse me of infidelity when he already knew the result. Under our prenup, that accusation would have cost me $500,000 and my inheritance. When Grant tried to interrupt, blaming hormones and confusion, I stopped him. I added that he had embezzled roughly $50,000 from clients to fund the scheme, that his firm was now investigating, that he carried significant gambling debts, and that for 8 months he had been involved with his assistant. I displayed photographs, dinners, hotel entrances, evidence that left no room for denial. I also revealed that years earlier he had targeted another woman with family wealth who was now prepared to testify. His mother finally asked him, quietly, if any of it was true. He couldn't answer. Molly Brennan stepped forward and admitted her role, confirming she had already spoken to police. Derek followed, stating he had been misled. The room fell silent as 2 officers approached and placed Grant under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement. As they led him away, he made one final attempt to manipulate me, asking me to think of our child and our family. I looked at him and replied calmly, "You're right. We've worked it out." I watched as the car drove down the gravel path, past the gardens my grandmother had planted decades earlier. The guests stood in silence. My mother came to my side and told me she was proud. Grant was denied bail due to flight risk, and his situation unraveled quickly. His firm confirmed the missing funds and filed charges. His assistant resigned and disappeared. Another woman came forward publicly. The divorce concluded swiftly, with the prenup working against him instead of me. The criminal case moved forward with testimony and documentation, and every charge held. His parents stopped attending court. His father issued a brief statement. His mother withdrew from public view. And with that, everything Grant had built on deception finally collapsed under the weight of the truth. Grant Mercer, who had entered my life 4 years earlier with calculated charm, would spend the next several years in prison. When he was eventually released, he would have nothing waiting for him. No money, no career, no family willing to stand by him, and no future targets who wouldn't uncover his criminal record with a simple search. The scheme he had constructed so carefully and over so much time ultimately closed in on him. My baby was born 4 months after the party, healthy, perfect, and completely innocent of everything that had happened. Some people asked whether I planned to contact Derek Sykes or involve him in any way. I considered it, but Derek was a 28-year-old graduate student who made a poor decision because he needed money. He wasn't ready to be a father, didn't want to be one, and I didn't need him to be. My child would have me, would have my mother, finally back in my life where she belonged, and would have the entire Wilson family, along with the legacy my grandmother built through decades of effort and care. That was enough. It was everything. Through all of this, I learned that family isn't defined by DNA. It isn't about blood tests, biology, or genetic charts. Family is about who shows up, who stays, and who chooses you every day, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. My mother chose me when I didn't deserve it. I chose my child when the situation was complicated. That is what family truly means. My mother and I now have lunch together every week, slowly repairing 2 lost years, one conversation at a time. She never once said, "I told you so." Eventually, I asked her why. She set down her coffee and smiled, saying that watching me bring that man down was more satisfying than any 4 words ever could be. I laughed, my first real laugh in what felt like a very long time. 3 weeks after the party, early one morning, I sat in my grandmother's kitchen, now my kitchen, in the house Grant had wanted so badly. Sunlight streamed through windows that had watched 4 generations of Wilson women live their lives, the same windows my grandmother had looked through while drinking her morning tea 50 years earlier. I made myself a cup of chamomile using her recipe and her favorite brand. Some traditions are worth keeping. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother asking about lunch tomorrow. I smiled and replied, "Always." Outside, the gardens were in full bloom, the roses my grandmother planted as a young bride, the hydrangeas she added when my mother was born, and the lavender border I helped her plant when I was 10, pressing dirt around each seedling as she told me stories about our family. I rested my hand on my belly and felt the baby move. Grant Mercer had tried to take everything from me, my money, my reputation, my future, my peace. What he actually did was show me how strong I had always been. Some people spend their entire lives waiting for karma. I was fortunate enough to deliver mine personally, with documentation and 50 witnesses. My grandmother used to say that Wilson women don't break. We bend, we adapt, and we survive. And when someone tries to destroy us, we rise and build something better. Grant thought he married an easy target. He married a Wilson, and now he had plenty of time to reflect on that mistake. Thank you for watching. More stories are available on your screen. Choose one and continue. See you in the next story.